The studio lights blazed hot as Dan Bongino sat across from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, his jaw clenched tight and eyes burning with a mix of anticipation and frustration. What began as a routine interview on his political podcast was about to erupt into one of the most talked about confrontations of the year. "You think you can come on my show and avoid accountability?" Bonino's voice sliced through the tense air like a blade, his fists slamming down on the desk between them. The crack echoed through the studio as the cameras rolled, capturing every moment that would soon become a defining scene in America's political theater. But Governor Abbott didn't flinch. He sat coolly in his chair, posture impeccable, a calm and calculated expression on his face. The look of a man who had weathered far more than a shouting match in a studio. There was no trace of panic, only the still confidence of someone who had been in the arena long enough to expect this exact moment. What Abbott said next wouldn't just quiet Bongino, it would ripple across the internet, sparking debate and reflection across the political spectrum. Before we dive into how this explosive exchange unfolded, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because these are the moments reshaping the face of American politics. Drop a comment below and let us know. Did Governor Abbott hold his ground, or did Bongino go too far? This wasn't just another heated political back and forth. This was the moment when a seasoned leader faced down a firebrand host, not with bluster or bravado, but with clarity, composure, and unshakable resolve. What happened over the next 20 minutes would alter the public's perception of both men, and perhaps of how leadership should look in today's media age. The tension in the studio was thick enough to slice with a knife. Bongino, once a Secret Service agent and now a hard-charging icon of conservative media, believed he held the upper hand. He'd brought Abbott onto the show expecting to corner him, to challenge him on border policy, COVID measures, and fiscal decisions, and walk away with another viral takedown under his belt. What he hadn't counted on was that the governor of Texas wasn't just another Republican guest trying to appease his base. Abbott had governed through crises, faced national scrutiny, and stood before adversaries far more formidable than a podcast host with a chip on his shoulder. Just minutes before cameras rolled, Bongino was seen pacing behind his desk, hyping himself up for what he envisioned as a career-defining confrontation. His producer had armed him with talking points, polling data, and a list of policy decisions they believed would corner Abbott. The plan was simple: hit hard, hit fast, and push until Abbott faltered. Meanwhile, Abbott had arrived at the studio early. While Bongino rehearsed his verbal jabs, the governor was calmly reviewing briefing notes, double-checking facts, and mentally rehearsing the responses he knew would be needed. His communications team had warned him this wouldn't be a standard policy chat, but Abbott insisted on showing up. He had nothing to hide, and he wouldn't be bullied out of defending his record. The production crew was on edge. They'd seen how Bongino had unraveled past guests, often turning calm conversations into combative spectacles. Many either shouted back, looking just as unhinged, or stumbled, lost in the verbal crossfire. Bongino almost always walked away looking like the victor, but this time felt different. Even the lighting technician whispered that he'd never seen a guest so composed before one of Bonino's infamous ambush interviews. The stage was set for a showdown. On one side sat Bongino, loud, combative, pressing hard with interruptions and ideological fervor. On the other side sat Abbott, measured, methodical, unmoved by provocation. What followed would become a lesson in the power of controlled leadership in an age of televised chaos. Bonino's style was all about domination, not through reason, but through sheer force of personality. On the other side sat Governor Greg Abbott, calm, prepared, measured, and absolutely unshakable in his demeanor. What happened next would become a textbook example of how to preserve dignity under fire, and the internet was about to pay attention in a very big way. To fully grasp the magnitude of this confrontation, it's important to understand who these two figures are and why their clash represented something far more consequential than a tense interview. Dan Bongino had built his media empire by being the loudest, angriest voice in the room. Once a Secret Service agent who served during the Obama administration, Bongino had since transformed into one of the most aggressive and polarizing figures in conservative media. His podcast, fueled by outrage and rapid-fire rhetoric, consistently ranked among the top in political commentary. Millions tuned in not for thoughtful debate, but to hear Bongino dismantle his opponents with insults, interruptions, and outrage. His rise hadn't been overnight. After leaving the Secret Service in 2011, Bongino took a shot at politics, running unsuccessfully for Congress and then the Senate. Those defeats only deepened his disdain for what he saw as a corrupt and soft political establishment. Instead of giving up, he pivoted, channeling his fury into a media career that glorified conflict and controversy. His formula was simple: create chaos, shout over your guest, clip the most dramatic 20 seconds, and watch the views, and ad dollars flood in. He had catchphrases like, "Liberalism is a mental disorder," and "Democrats hate America." And while his approach alienated many, it energized his base. To them, he was the truth teller, the bulldog, the warrior who said what others were afraid to say. He never let guests finish a sentence. He didn't aim to discuss, he aimed to destroy. And in most cases, it worked. His guests either fumbled under pressure or lost their temper. Either way, Bongino walked away looking like the dominant voice in the room. But this time, his guest wasn't a freshman politician or a media novice. This time, it was Texas Governor Greg Abbott. And Abbott was cut from a very different cloth. A seasoned political leader with years of executive experience, Abbott had navigated some of the most complex crises in modern Texas history: hurricanes, border challenges, pandemics, energy grid collapses, all under the intense scrutiny of both the national media and his own party. He had survived lawsuits, protests, and party rebellions. He wasn't there to perform, he was there to lead. Abbott's rise hadn't been without challenge. A tragic accident in his youth had left him paralyzed from the waist down, but it hadn't slowed him. He went on to become Attorney General of Texas and later, one of the longest-serving governors in the state's history. His legal mind was sharp, his political instincts sharper, and his ability to stay composed under pressure nearly unmatched. Where Bongino brought heat, Abbott brought control. Where Bongino lashed out, Abbott calculated. He had long understood that leadership wasn't about being the loudest man in the room. It was about being the most consistent one. And while some critics within his own party believed he was too methodical, too restrained, Abbott believed that results spoke louder than theatrics. This confrontation was about to test that philosophy. Governor Abbott was no stranger to high-stakes pressure. During his decades in public service, he had faced legal battles, media scrutiny, and crises that would have rattled lesser leaders. He had stood his ground through storms, both literal and political, and had come out the other side tested, sharpened, and calm. As Attorney General, Abbott had argued and won cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He had taken on challenges most politicians would have avoided, defending state sovereignty, implementing controversial laws, and navigating complex constitutional fights. His tenure was marked by lawsuits, intense partisanship, and policy clashes that put him at odds with both federal authorities and advocacy groups. He had withstood personal attacks, lawsuits, and relentless public criticism, and never once cracked under the pressure. He was known in Austin and beyond as a methodical operator, a legal tactician who prepared for every public appearance with the same precision he brought to court filings. His calm wasn't performative, it was deliberate, and on Bongino's turf, he was about to put that composure to the ultimate test. This interview was about far more than just two men. It was a representation of two distinct paths in conservative politics. Bongino represented the old guard, microphone-thumping firebrand, loud, accusatory, constantly on the offensive. Abbott, by contrast, stood for an executive style rooted in authority, data, and restraint, a leadership style that didn't seek to entertain, but to govern. In many ways, it was a referendum on the future of conservative political discourse. America's political climate had grown increasingly volatile, with reasoned debate replaced by viral shouting matches. Voters, including many conservatives, were growing weary. They weren't looking for noise. They were looking for leadership. This interview would become a test case. Could calm professionalism still carry weight in an era dominated by theatrical aggression? And what made this moment even more consequential was the era we're living in, the social media age. where a single clip, taken out of context or not, could shape narratives and end careers. Both Bongino and Abbot knew that whatever happened in that studio could be seen by millions within hours. The stage was built for Bongino. Literally, this was his home turf, his studio, his rules. Everything, from the camera angles to the lighting to the placement of the desk, was calibrated to enhance his dominance. The American flags, the red and blue lighting, and the framed photos of Bongino shaking hands with high-profile Republican figures, it all sent one message: this is my territory. Even the desk was symbolic, a divide that allowed Bongino to physically and psychologically control the space. Guests had to lean forward to speak. He only needed to lean in to overwhelm. But Abbot hadn't come in blind. He had done his homework. He had studied Bongino's previous interviews, taken note of the interruption patterns, the hot-button phrases, and the moments where Bongino tried to provoke guests into losing their cool. Abbot's team had run mock sessions, some of them intentionally confrontational, to rehearse staying on message and maintaining a steady tone no matter how aggressive the host became. He had faced more hostile environments, from press briefings during a power grid collapse to heated national debates on border policy. A podcast desk wouldn't rattle him. While Bongino was setting the stage for combat, Abbot was preparing for command. For Governor Abbot, this wasn't a crisis, it was routine. After decades in public office, walking into a politically charged environment like this was just another day at work. He had led through chaos, confronted national scrutiny, and remained standing while others buckled. But what made this moment even more significant was the broader reality unfolding in American political discourse. Public debate had hit a breaking point. Everywhere, reason was giving way to rage. Thoughtful conversation was being drowned out by shouting matches. Social media had turned political theater into a blood sport, rewarding outrage over insight and fueling division across the country. The American public was growing weary of it all. They weren't asking for silence. They were asking for sanity. They wanted leaders, not loud voices. They craved direction, not drama. Dan Bongino, to many, had come to represent the worst of what political media had become. His show, once a forum for robust conservative conversation, had evolved into a spectacle, a stage for conspiracy theories, personal insults, and bombastic tirades. His fans didn't tune in for solutions. They came to see someone own the libs. But that strategy came at a cost. The more he stirred outrage, the less room there was for actual governance. Political momentum was being replaced with performance, and it was making compromise, policy, and leadership nearly impossible. Abbot represented a different path forward. He believed you could be conservative without being cruel. That conviction and principle didn't require humiliation or mockery. That strong leadership could coexist with professional restraint. His entire career, from the courtroom to the governor's mansion, had been a study in balancing authority with discipline. The stakes of this interview couldn't have been higher. The confrontation was unfolding just weeks before a key election that could shift the balance of power in Washington. Every viral clip, every headline, every comment thread, it all had the power to move voters and define candidates. And both men knew it. The interview began with what seemed like standard fare. Bongino asked about state legislation, economic policy, and border enforcement. But there was tension in his voice from the start, the kind that his longtime listeners recognized as a prelude to attack. "Governor," Bongino began, his voice already sharpening, "you say you're protecting Texas, but your policies are enabling chaos. How do you justify actions that many believe are putting our citizens at risk?" Abbot didn't blink. He responded as he always did, with facts, statistics, and a calm tone. "Our security strategy has led to record interdictions and bipartisan support from local law enforcement," he explained, citing reports and official figures. "The situation at the border is serious, but we've taken real steps, not just rhetoric, to address it." But Bongino wasn't listening for answers. He was laying a trap. "That's not what I asked," Bongino snapped, raising his voice. "I asked how you justify risking the safety of Texans. Are you going to answer, or just give me rehearsed talking points?" It was one of his oldest tactics. Claim the question wasn't answered, even when it had been, then escalate. Governor Abbot, unmoved, leaned forward slightly. Dan, he said in his usual measured cadence, I've given you specific actions we've taken. Policy, not politics. I'm happy to expand on them if you'd like to discuss solutions. But Bongino wasn't looking for solutions. Don't give me that politician spin, he barked. My audience isn't stupid. They can see when someone's dodging. In the control room, the producers lit up. This was exactly what they'd hoped for. Confrontation, tension, volume. The recipe for virality. Bongino's team had seen this cycle play out 100 times. Push the guest, raise the temperature, get them to lose their cool, clip the explosion, post, repeat. But this time it wasn't working. Abbot remained steady, his breathing was even, his tone unchanging, his body language controlled. He'd been through worse, and unlike Bongino, he knew that true power didn't require yelling. The audio engineer monitored the levels. Bongino was edging into distortion. Abbot, by contrast, maintained a broadcast-perfect register. The camera operators had their orders. Focus on the contrast. The shouting host, the calm guest. The visual story was writing itself. Abbot's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but calculation. He knew what Bongino was doing, and he knew exactly how to neutralize it. I understand you're passionate about these issues, Dan, he said firmly, yet without hostility. And I respect that. But if this is meant to be a conversation about the future of Texas, I'm here for it. If it's meant to be a shouting match, I'll let you do that on your own. It hit like a cold bucket of water. Bongino wasn't used to guests staying composed when he turned up the volume. Most either matched his fury or fell apart. Abbot had done neither. He hadn't just deflected the attack. He'd redirected it, calmly and publicly, for all to see. And Bongino hated that. By this point in the interview, most political guests would have either snapped back with emotion or stumbled into verbal missteps. Exactly the kind of miscalculated reaction Bongino thrived on. That was his formula. Turn pressure into panic, then package it for views. But this time it wasn't working. Abbot wasn't giving him anything. He stayed calm, professional, grounded in the facts. And the more he did, the more visibly frustrated Bongino became. You could see the change in his posture, the cracks forming in his usual smug confidence. His go-to playbook was failing him, and he knew it. Then Bongino shifted gears. The topic turned to immigration, and with it, the stakes escalated. This, Bongino believed, would be his moment to corner the governor. Let's talk about the border crisis your state is failing to contain, he said, his tone hardening into an accusation. You're the governor of Texas, and yet you act like you've never seen what illegal immigration is doing to this country. How do you sleep at night, knowing your policies are putting American lives at risk? It was an ambush, a loaded attack meant to force Abbot into one of two traps: defend a policy too complex for sound bites or retreat under pressure. Bongino wanted him to squirm, but Abbot didn't. He leaned forward, hands calmly resting on the table. Dan, he began, his voice as even as ever, I've walked the border with sheriffs, with National Guard units, with federal agents. I've talked with ranchers whose lands are impacted daily, and I've overseen the deployment of billions of dollars to enhance security operations in this state. These are facts, not politics. And I'm here to discuss real policy, not engage in theater. It was a surgical response, unflinching, credentialed, and substantive. He hadn't just sidestepped the attack, he'd dismantled it. But Bongino didn't want substance. He wanted sparks. You know what? I'm sick of this, he snapped, now visibly angry. You establishment Republicans come on these shows, you dodge real questions, you play word games, then pretend you're above the fight. My audience deserves better than this polished nonsense. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bongino accused Abbot of playing games while theatrically escalating the very confrontation his show was built around. Abbot didn't bite. I've answered every question you've asked, he replied, voice unwavering, but now with a sharper edge beneath the calm. I've laid out specific actions, data, and funding initiatives. If you'd like to have a real policy discussion, I'm happy to keep going. But if your goal here is to yell until someone gives you a viral clip, I won't be part of that. And just like that, the studio's air changed. Bongino's face flushed a deep red. His voice, already elevated, was climbing into full-blown rage. Everyone behind the cameras could feel it. The point of no return was approaching fast. "Drama? You think this is drama?" Bongino shouted, his voice now echoing across the studio. "This is about the future of our country, about hard-working Americans being robbed by failed leadership. You sit there like everything's fine, while our borders are wide open." The volume was deafening. Bongino was no longer debating, he was unraveling. And then Abbot did something that stunned the room. He smiled, not sarcastically, not smugly, just calmly. It was the kind of expression that conveyed total control. That said, "You're yelling because you're losing." That smile didn't just deflect Bongino's aggression, it reversed the entire dynamic in the room. Bongino looked unhinged. Abbot looked unshakable. In that moment, without raising his voice or even interrupting, Governor Greg Abbott had flipped the script. By now, it was clear to everyone watching. Dan Bongino had lost control. And Governor Greg Abbott? He looked every bit the statesman in the room. While Bongino's anger burned hotter, Abbott's calm only deepened. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. But that contrast, that restraint, was precisely what pushed Bongino over the edge. Realizing his usual tactics weren't shaking Abbott's composure, Bongino reached for the nuclear option. In a moment that would become one of the most rewatched political meltdowns of the year, he abruptly stood up from his chair, leaned across the desk, and unleashed a verbal barrage that broke every norm of professional discourse. "You know what your problem is?" he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Abbott. "You walk in here like you've got it all figured out, like you're too good to answer to my audience. You think just because you've been governor for a decade you're untouchable? I've been exposing frauds like you long before you ever set foot in that mansion in Austin." The volume was explosive, the studio filled with the echo of Bongino's voice bouncing off the walls as every camera rolled and every microphone strained to capture what had descended into pure spectacle. It was raw, loud, and wholly unbecoming of someone who once claimed to be a voice for accountability. Abbott, by contrast, didn't even flinch. The camera crew was working overtime, cutting between Bongino's flushed, contorted face and Abbott's still composed posture. The contrast was so extreme it felt surreal, as though two completely separate interviews were being stitched together in real time. Behind the scenes, Bongino's production team was in a state of chaos. Was this genius television or a complete implosion? Would this go viral for the right reasons or the exact wrong ones? One thing was certain, this wasn't dominance. This wasn't strength. This was a meltdown. And the world was watching. The sound engineer scrambled to control the peaks as Bongino's voice soared into territory better suited for demolition sites than political discourse. Meanwhile, Abbott's audio levels hadn't changed once since the show began. Unwavering, steady, deliberate. And then, in a moment that would go down in political media history, Abbott calmly looked across the desk and waited. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't break eye contact. He didn't even adjust his posture. He simply waited. And when Bongino finally ran out of breath, Governor Abbott spoke, quietly, confidently, and with the full force of disciplined leadership behind every word. "Dan," he said, his voice steady as ever, "I can see you're passionate about the issues we're discussing, and I respect that. But I think your audience deserves more than a shouting match. They deserve a real conversation, and that's what I came here to have." The studio fell into stunned silence. It wasn't just the words, it was the delivery. Abbott had just dismantled Bongino's entire performance with a single paragraph. He acknowledged the emotion without validating the outburst. He positioned himself as the adult in the room. And perhaps most powerfully, he spoke directly to Bongino's viewers, many of whom were already second-guessing what they were watching. The effect was immediate. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Bongino's head. He hadn't expected that, not from a Republican, not from someone he assumed would fold or flare up. But Abbott had done neither, and the governor wasn't finished. "I understand that your model is built around confrontation and spectacle," Abbott continued, his tone measured, his cadence unshaken. "And clearly it's worked well for you. But I didn't come here to be a target in a media stunt. I came here to discuss policy that affects real Texans and real Americans. The camera caught it perfectly. The precise moment Bongino realized his strategy had completely collapsed. What was meant to be a power play had backfired in the worst way. The guest wasn't embarrassed. The host was. Abbot, seated with calm authority, had absorbed every aggressive tactic Bongino had thrown at him and turned them into self-inflicted wounds. The swagger was gone from Bongino's eyes. He wasn't steering the ship anymore. The man who had built his entire persona on always having the last word now stood frozen, speechless, hunched awkwardly over his own desk as his guest sat calmly, having just dismantled the foundation of his show's confrontational playbook. And then came the line, the quote that would dominate headlines and Twitter feeds for days. If you'd like to have an adult conversation about policy differences, I'm ready. But if you just want to yell and point fingers, you can do that without me. The silence that followed was thunderous. Bongino, the same man who had built his brand on being unshakable, who had made his name by silencing opponents, had nothing. For the first time, he looked like the one who'd been silenced. He slowly sank back into his seat, face flushed, voice subdued. "I'm not yelling," he muttered, a line so tone-deaf it left the entire room in disbelief, given that moments earlier he had been at full volume, jabbing his finger across the desk. "I'm just passionate about defending my audience from politicians who don't tell the truth." Abbot didn't hesitate. His reply was as swift as it was surgical. "Dan, I've been telling the truth this entire interview. I've laid out facts, data, and specifics. What I haven't done is yell, accuse, or question your integrity. The contrast speaks for itself." And with that, it was over. Everyone in the studio could feel it. The momentum had shifted completely. The takedown that Bongino had envisioned had turned into a live demonstration of what leadership under pressure really looked like. The supposed ambush had backfired, spectacularly. From that point on, the tone of the interview changed entirely. Bongino, visibly rattled, spent the rest of the segment trying to claw back credibility. But every question he asked felt small, almost petulant. And each time Abbot responded, calmly, factually, professionally, it only deepened the contrast. When the interview finally wrapped, the power dynamics were undeniable. Bongino's trademark swagger was gone, replaced by the look of a man who had just been bested, not by volume or aggression, but by composure and discipline. Abbot stood, shook his hand, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked off the set with the same calm professionalism he'd carried throughout the conversation, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone watching knew something had happened. The contrast between the two men was impossible to miss. One had maintained dignity and discipline. The other had lost control. And along with it, the narrative. The cameras had caught it all, and the internet was already responding. Within minutes of the segment ending, clips of the exchange exploded across social media. The moment Bongino yelled, and Abbot smiled, was being shared, reposted, and dissected by millions. By the end of the first hour, #Abbot Stays Calm was trending nationwide. The reaction came fast. Political commentators from all corners of the ideological spectrum weighed in, and surprisingly, the consensus was nearly unanimous. Even many conservatives, Bongino's own fans, were calling it what it was, a meltdown. "I watch Bongino every week, but that was embarrassing," tweeted one conservative influencer. "Abbot handled that like a pro. Dan looked like he was losing his mind. We can disagree without screaming." One viral video montage showed it all. The yelling, the pointing, the towering stance. Followed immediately by a sharp cut to Abbot, seated, composed, speaking in a measured tone with unwavering eye contact. It needed no commentary. The contrast told the story. Bongino's strategy had turned in on itself. The man who prided himself on breaking his guests had been broken by something much more powerful than volume: restraint. The visual contrast told the entire story. No narration necessary. Bongino, red-faced and yelling. Abbot, silent and composed. Liberal outlets had a field day, of course. But what made this moment extraordinary was that the criticism wasn't just coming from the left. It was erupting from within Bongino's own camp. Conservative commentators, even those known for their own firebrand tactics, began quietly backing away from the incident. Bongino hadn't just lost his temper. He had crossed a line and in doing so, made an entire political movement look unserious, unstable, and hostile to discourse. "This is exactly why people hate politics," tweeted a moderate GOP strategist. Governor Abbot showed up to answer policy questions. Bongino responded by yelling like a child. The governor didn't even have to fight back. He made Bongino look foolish just by staying calm. The numbers painted a clearer picture than any headline could. Bongino's own social media team had uploaded the original clip, likely expecting praise, high shares, and celebratory engagement. And sure enough, the clip was shared over 50,000 times in the first 2 hours. But the comment section wasn't what they'd hoped for. The majority of replies weren't congratulating Bongino. They were applauding Abbot. Viewers, many of them longtime subscribers, were stunned at what they had witnessed. Not a strong debate, not accountability, but a meltdown. "I've been following Dan for years," one regular listener wrote, "but that was hard to watch. Governor Abbot answered every question and stayed cool. Dan just lost it." That's not the kind of conservatism I signed up for. Media analysts and political communicators quickly jumped in, dissecting the footage frame by frame. The governor's performance, his tone, posture, even the timing of his pauses, became a case study in strategic restraint. Abbott didn't just win the exchange, he redefined it, said a former White House communications director on CNN. He stayed calm, focused, and dignified. He didn't take the bait, and in doing so, he turned Bongino's aggression into a mirror, one that reflected poorly on the host. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from Bongino's own loyal fan base. His podcast audience, the very people he counted on to rally behind him, had expected a debate. What they got was a breakdown. And they weren't impressed. The more time passed, the clearer the divide became. While the criticism of Bongino surged, praise for Abbott poured in, and not just from moderate voices or liberals. Conservative women in particular highlighted the governor's demeanor as the kind of leadership they wanted to see more of in public office. Strong, steady, not performative. As requests for comment poured in, both camps responded. Abbott's office released a brief but telling statement. Governor Abbott welcomes respectful discussion on the challenges facing our nation. Even in moments of disagreement, he remains committed to civility and serious policy debate. Bongino, however, took a different route, one that only worsened the perception of his performance. Instead of taking a breath and reflecting, he doubled down. "I'm not going to apologize for being passionate," he said on his follow-up show. "If Governor Abbott can't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be governor." But anyone who watched the exchange knew Abbott had handled every question, and then some. He didn't flinch, he didn't shout, he didn't evade. And Bongino's desperate defense only reinforced what the clip had already proven. The real issue wasn't whether tough questions had been asked, it was who had stayed composed enough to answer them. Governor Abbott had answered every question with clarity and precision. It was Bongino who had failed to handle his guests' calm, fact-based responses. And when he tried to spin the moment afterward, claiming he was simply being passionate, it only reinforced the impression that he was unwilling to take responsibility for his own behavior. But the impact of this confrontation would stretch far beyond the two men on camera. The viral nature of Abbott's response, dignified, professional, and completely unshaken, was being cited as a clear signal. Americans are ready for a different kind of political discourse. Polls conducted in the days following the interview revealed a surprising consensus across both major parties. A broad majority of voters, regardless of political affiliation, said they preferred Abbott's approach to political communication over the usual shouting match format. Campaign strategists in both Democratic and Republican circles took notice. For decades, political media had rewarded the loudest voices, those who could interrupt, dominate, and provoke. But now, for the first time in recent memory, composure, clarity, and command of facts were being celebrated as the winning strategy. Abbott had proven what many had forgotten in the era of viral conflict. You can win a political battle without ever raising your voice and without ever losing your dignity. University professors and political communication experts across the country began to cite the interview as a case study. Dr. Sarah Mitchell of Georgetown University's School of Public Policy told her students that the Abbot-Bongino exchange represented a watershed moment in American media. This was a demonstration, she explained, that calm professionalism can be more powerful than aggressive theatrics. It challenges the assumption that the only way to get heard in politics today is to shout. The interview also triggered quiet introspection across the television industry. Behind the scenes, producers and hosts were asking themselves a difficult question. Is this high-volume, confrontational format still sustainable? Or has it finally jumped the shark? With viral moments capable of defining a public figure's entire brand overnight, the risk of looking like a bully, especially when attacking a calm and composed guest, was simply too great. Cable news executives reportedly held late-night meetings to reassess their programming models. Focus groups were clear. Viewers were becoming turned off by hosts who lost control or berated guests for spectacle. And while political analysts pored over every frame, late-night comedians pounced. Saturday Night Live aired a now viral parody of the interview, with the comedian playing Bongino getting increasingly red in the face while Governor Abbott calmly sat across from him, occasionally sipping water and asking if he'd like to take a deep breath. The sketch was hilarious, but the underlying narrative was serious, and it stuck. Bongino's loss of control had become a national punchline. Abbott's calm had become the gold standard. But perhaps the most significant outcome was what happened next in Abbott's career. The confrontation had done for him what years of traditional campaigning hadn't. It elevated his national profile, not as a culture warrior, but as a steady hand, a statesman, someone who could lead under pressure and lead with principle. He began receiving invitations from major networks to speak on national issues. Long-form profiles appeared in publications that rarely gave Republicans favorable coverage. Editorials called him a rare voice of reason in an age of chaos. And the public took notice too, with their wallets. Abbott's campaign saw a major surge in small-dollar donations in the weeks following the interview. Contributions poured in from all 50 states. Many donors included messages referencing the viral moment. "I'm from Oregon, and I've never donated to a Republican before," wrote one supporter. "But after seeing how professionally you handled that clown, I had to support you. We need more leaders like that." That was the headline on more than one editorial the next morning. The response to Governor Greg Abbott's calm, commanding performance wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. Republican strategists quickly recognized that Abbott's demeanor presented a striking contrast to the more aggressive style embraced by many in their own ranks. And in an election year, that contrast mattered. Polling conducted in the days following the interview revealed something few had predicted. Swing voters, independents, and even moderate conservatives overwhelmingly preferred Abbott's calm, policy-focused tone over Bongino's hostility. For campaign managers across the political spectrum, it was a wake-up call. If composure, facts, and maturity were becoming more effective than confrontation, then entire campaign strategies would need to shift. Some GOP consultants quietly began advising their clients to soften their approach. Less shouting, more substance. Because now they had proof. You didn't have to dominate the room to win it. You just had to own the moment with dignity. The interview also sparked broader discussions about political communication, especially in conservative circles. For years, the model had been clear. Fight fire with fire. Now, communication experts were suggesting a new formula. Fight fire with ice. The Abbot-Bongino exchange wasn't just a turning point in tone, and it became a masterclass. Universities began incorporating the footage into public speaking and media training seminars. Political science professors dissected it in real time with students. A Georgetown public policy lecturer summed it up this way. Governor Abbott demonstrated that strategic calmness, when rooted in facts, can neutralize even the most aggressive attack. It challenged the belief that you must be loud to be effective. Late-night comedy shows, Never Ones to Miss a Moment, ran parodies. Saturday Night Live produced a skit with a frenzied Bongino actor storming across the studio while Governor Abbott remained unfazed, offering him a bottle of water and asking, "Would you like a moment to regroup?" The sketch went viral, not because it exaggerated, but because it didn't need to. The public had already seen the real version. Meanwhile, Abbott's political stocks surged. Requests for interviews came in from across the country. Speaking invitations piled up. His calm rebuttal had gone beyond the Texas border. Well, now he was being mentioned in national profiles, Sunday shows, and even international press as a potential voice of reason in a chaotic political landscape. Book publishers and global conferences reached out to his team. There was talk of a book, not about policy, but about leadership under pressure. He was invited to speak at universities on political communication and executive decision-making. What had started as an ambush interview had turned into a full-blown rebranding moment. Abbott hadn't just protected his reputation, he had elevated it, and he'd done it without raising his voice, slamming a desk, or throwing a punch. As the weeks went on, the video continued to circulate. Clips of Abbott calmly countering aggression became required viewing and communications training across industries. A top executive coach who trains Fortune 500 CEOs summed it up like this: "The old model was alpha energy, overpower the room. But what Governor Abbott showed is that real leadership, the kind that lasts, comes from presence, not volume." The coolest head in the room is often the strongest. The moment Bongino thought would define his brand ended up redefining someone else's. And as the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. Governor Greg Abbott had shown the nation that you don't need to shout to lead. You just need to be unshakable when it counts.